Good morning. I'm Marty Downs. I manage the Long-Term Ecological Research Network Office. I'm just going to say a few words about the network and the community calls, and then hand it off to our speaker for this month. LTER Network was founded to address ecological questions that can't be resolved with short-term observations or experiments. And research at LTER sites contributes to the development and testing of ecological theories and advances understanding of long-term dynamics of populations, communities, and ecosystems. The network now includes 27 sites and the LTER Network Office, which coordinates network-level activities, including synthetic research, education, and outreach programs, and provides centralized representation of the network to the broader scientific community and to the public. So these monthly community calls are an opportunity to learn from and about your colleagues across the network, who include over 2,000 participants, investigators, postdocs, students, educators, information managers, technicians, and other professionals all doing amazing work. We'll talk in the community calls about emerging initiatives, spin-off projects, related organizations, or do deep dives into LTR science, education, and engagement. This is a sort of new effort in the network, which we're excited about, using these monthly calls to gather all of the people who are involved in the network around particular interests. And I encourage you to mark your calendar for the fourth Wednesday of each month and join us for one or several whenever the topic interests you. And because it's a new initiative, we'd love to hear from you all about what you'd like to, about topics that you'd like to cover in the community calls. The LTR network has a code of conduct. As it applies to these calls, it is essentially treat everyone on the call with respect and address ideas rather than individuals. And you can find the full code of conduct at lternet.edu/code-of-conduct. And with that, I will hand it off to Molly Phillips, our Inclusion and Access Coordinator, to introduce our speaker, Haley Branch.
Hey, Marty, should I hit record?
I did hit
Oh, okay.
Did? What happened?
Oh, it shows it's recording. Sorry.
Okay.
Usually
Yeah.
another zoom up. Okay, usually that button is like grayed out and it's still red for me. Okay, never mind. Hi everybody. I'm Molly Phillips. Pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I am one of the newer members of the LTR Network Office, and I'm excited to introduce our speaker today. She'll be giving a talk titled Increasing Diversity in Fieldwork Through Access and Transparency. Haley Branch is a plant evolutionary ecologist who researches centers around traits associated with stress responses. And she's currently a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University, where she's studying plant evolutionary ecology, as well as accessibility in field stations and in field work. So I will hand it over to Haley now. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Molly. So hi, everyone. I'm Haley. My pronouns are she, her. I am just to give a visual, I'm a white woman with long brown hair that also has some blonde in it, bleached underneath. I'm wearing a burgundy shirt and I have a white and brown scarf on. And right now I am joining you from my home. And so in the background, you can see that I have Valentine's Day decorations up behind me, and a image, a botanical drawing of the species that I work on is behind me, which is scarlet monkey flower. So I'm very excited to be here today. And a bit about who I am. As Molly said, I am an evolutionary ecologist. I study how plants adapt and respond to severe climatic events, such as drought or heat stress. And I am currently an NSF PRFB postdoc at Yale in the Ecology and Evolutionary Department in Jen Coughlin's lab. But I've also had a lot of experience as a disability awareness advocate and access activist during my graduate degree at the University of British Columbia, where I also led a number of things regarding disability, such as increasing how we evaluate, or I studied how we evaluate productivity in disabled scholars, and specifically this was for faculty positions. But you can also, I love being in the field. I am disabled. I use a wheelchair, but that doesn't stop me from getting out and about. And you can, these are some of my contact info, the Twitter and Blue Sky. The outline for today is I'm going to walk you through a bit of terminology around disability and ableism, and give a bit of a background of demographics and statistics of disabled people in the US, but also in academia specifically. Then I'm going to give an introduction to the project and what this is actually going to look like, and what I want from you, or what I'm excited about, and maybe if you can share a bit about what you might be excited about as well. And I want to just highlight that this nice quote about how experiencing the outdoors has more to do with accessibility and ableism rather than ability of the individual. And so so there's a number of terms that I would like to draw attention to. I guess actually, first off, you'll notice that I use the words disabled person compared to person with disability. This is an individual kind of, what's the word? Sorry, I sometimes forget my words. A person, like, it's my personal preference. I go by, there's either person first language or identity first. So I go by identity first. And so for me, I go by a disabled person. And so that kind of language, you'll notice, varies from place to place. Oftentimes, when we look at federal level, they use person first language. But for me, I like to highlight the fact that I am disabled because I'm quite proud about it. But the general rule of thumb is just ask whomever you're working with what they prefer. Disableism is just the differential and unequal treatment of someone with a disability. And this really stems from an idea of superior ways of being and what a human body should look like and act like and be. And these come from social norms, generally from the perspective of a white, athletic, slim, Christian heteronormative view of what bodies are. And generally, most would say that they aren't disableist, so they don't necessarily specifically treat a disabled person differently. But in fact, a lot of people are ableist. And so ableism comes from this deep-rooted idea about beliefs and practices that a particular body and mind has. And this comes from a species typical state. And I can go on a whole thing about what we mean even in ecology and evolution, about what a species typical or optimal phenotype is, but this bleeds into our understanding of how humans are. And I often like to think about this image here. You see someone in a wheelchair, and I'll bring up wheelchairs quite a lot just because that's my personal experience, but there are oodles of ways that the body is, and lots of different form and function of the body. So disability comes in all kinds of shapes and forms. But in this example here, there's someone in a wheelchair, but they might be able to work perfectly fine, but the inability to get to work prevents them from working rather than the actual work itself. And this generally is because in society, we are building based on some type of species typical idea, and that's generally stairs, whereas a ramp could easily have been put in place. And so anyone can basically be disabled who, if they experience disableism in their life, and it's generally thought that it's one or more traits that result in inaccess in everyday society life. And going back to that example of, well, you could have just built a ramp. One view of this disability is the social view of it, which is a construct, and that the opposite of disabled is not able-bodied, it's actually enabled. And so someone who is, quote, able-bodied is just the norm that we associate with a building. So we build those stairs. So you wouldn't be able to get to that door either if those stairs weren't built. So you're enabled to get into that building. But a disabled person is not enabled, so they are disabled to get into that building. And so it's just a different way of looking at it. I also want to highlight that disability and access is an intersectional issue. Black and Indigenous people have higher rates of disability. Women are more likely to have missed and undiagnosed illnesses and disabilities. Trans folks are also more likely to be mistreated by the medical system and have undiagnosed disabilities. And this also for lower socioeconomic status are less likely to be treated for disabilities. And so this the issue of access in our communities, but also in academia, is quite intersectional. And if we want to increase and diversify academia, we need to also really start thinking about the disability portion of this, because it affects, it has a compounding effect for marginalized peoples. I mentioned that disability is quite diverse. Disability can also not be seen, it can be invisible. And so what we might see on the surface might look like someone who looks like the social norm. But what we don't see can be an underlying, all kinds of different challenges that a person might have. And when we're also talking about disability and advocacy, we want to make sure that we're not preventing individuals from participating that we might not be thinking about, or feel like they are excluded simply because they don't have a visible disability. So this probably goes without saying, is that no one's disability is no one's right to know someone's disability status or what they have. And so one should always the individual themselves knows their body best. And if one says they have a disability, they have a disability. Disabilities can be chronic, but they can also be short term. And they can be hearing, they could be learning, they could be about mobility or developmental, ambulatory, which means that they kind of come and go. They can change throughout time. So disability is can be quite dynamic. And so what a person might need on a given day might change from day to day. It could be sensory related. Mental state, mental illness is also a disability. And these things can be cyclical. And this can also be illness related, something that's developed later on in life, something that's contracted, or it can be from birth. So there are so many different ways that individuals can be disabled. And it makes it a really amazing and beautiful community because it is incredibly diverse. And the way we all experience life is diverse, and so is the way individuals experience disability. Now, if we're thinking about field work, there are so many aspects of field work that can become a concern when we're thinking about accessibility. Obviously, when we first think about field work, we're thinking about the actual physical labor of field work and how do you get from point A to B? So those are the remoteness, the unpredictability. There's a lot of people with access concerns will have a greater amount of planning that is involved, and that can actually just be so tiresome that it can be a barrier to getting into the field. Miscommunication is a really common issue with accessibility, not knowing what is available or not knowing what they can ask for in advance, and then having issues once there because there wasn't enough understanding prior to the actual field season. And then things that can happen in the field because of, depending on what one might need, is like a lack of support or aids. So if someone needs an interpreter, is an interpreter also able to come? Are there funds available for this sort of thing? Service dogs. A lot of research sites are dog forbidden. There's not a lot of information about whether service dogs are allowed to go into these sort of field areas. What does that look like? Something even as simple as a refrigerator can be a barrier to field work, and whether someone can bring an assistant. I bring up those ones because some of these are issues that I have had when going into the field or doing any type of my research. So a lot of the time, what I would need is extra support, and a lot of grants that one might have don't actually allow one to pay for labor. And so you can't hire an additional like tech support or someone with a lot of fellowships and grants that one might receive. But why is it important to make LTERs accessible? And so this is me at an LTER a couple of years ago. I'm very excited. You can't see how big my smile is, but it's huge. And this was the first time I got to go to an LTER, and it was really, it was an NSF funded working group where I got to work with an amazing group of people and made lifelong collaborators and friends from it. And when I first got invited to join, we weren't sure what to expect. I remember looking on the website, not really knowing what was going to be accessible, what wasn't, what was in place for me. And I kind of ended up just having to wing it. And it ended up that there was a lot of things about it that were really accessible, and a lot of people didn't even know. And that's kind of where some of these ideas that I'm going to share with you come from, is my own experience where I was suddenly like, oh my gosh, I could have been doing field work my entire PhD. I didn't get to do any because my advisor and I had no clue where I would be able to go and do it. I wanted to do desert work, so the Sevietta would have been perfect for this type of experiment I was doing. But we couldn't figure out where would I lodge, where would I actually be able to do these kinds of things. And so I went my entire 5.5 years of my degree really wanting to do field work, but having no capacity to do it. And so a couple of years ago, I also had the awesome chance to work with Dr. Danielle Piers on this paper for American Naturalist. And something that they said to me was that, by not including disabled people, we're essentially losing out on 25%, so a quarter of our population's perspective. And some say that 25% is actually a lowball number for the proportion of individuals that identify with disability. But on average, we have about a quarter of adults in the US that identify as being disabled. And if we're looking at academically, that represents about 19.4% of our undergraduate population, 12% of graduate students, 10% of postdocs, and then again, 10% of tenured full professors. But something we know about disability is that it increases with age. And so what you would actually expect is that this number should be going up instead of declining or staying stationary here. And this is tenured full professors. So these are going to be professors that are, I guess, I don't know how long it takes to get tenure, but I'm saying like at least 8 years in to their faculty position, or about 8 years. I don't know. I just saw someone get tenure and there was 10 years. So it all depends, right? Another thing is that even there's a barrier to get into higher education, where this comes from Stats Canada, but that visible minorities had a 16.6% lower rate of enrolling and receiving a bachelor's degree than non-visible minorities. And these are still considered, this is still within the lens of a minority group. And so that highlights again some of that compounding effect of marginalization. We don't have a lot of data about how many disabled people do field work. That's a whole nother thing that could happen in the future. But my goals are that I imagine it's a very low percentage of people that have that are disabled that get to do field work. And I would like to increase that and reduce the barrier to that. And the first goal of this is to create a basic training guide for LTERs to use to help train staff and other students and PIs that might work at LTERs, but also to develop a survey that can be used at all the LTERs, basically, where that can assess current accessibility. Because as I mentioned, so this is the SEV again, there are already a lot of accessible things in place at a lot of LTERs that we don't even know about, and then suggest areas for improvement. The idea for this is to visit at least around 10 locations myself, but every location I'm hoping will do an assessment. The first one, it's a question mark because maybe someone else will want to squeeze me in earlier, but will be to go to NIWAT in Colorado, at Boulder, in August. And this is where I will also create a how-to guide for the assessments. So I'll do like a video guide as well. I have funds for this. So this is NSF funded. I have a lot of travel funds to go to the LTERs to do these assessments and to help anyone who might require that. But I also imagine a lot of locations have people who might be really excited about this already and who would be willing to do that assessment once there's sort of a guide and a survey readily available. The next steps for this is to take this survey and this assessment. So I'll be looking at the outside field area. So what kind of terrain is it? What's the path movement around the various sites like? Is there lodging? What's the lodging look like? Research and lab areas as well. Also any type of eating facilities and all these kinds of things. The plan is also to make a video because inevitably we will not be able to capture everything that someone might require to understand the facility. And so this will help others make individual assessments on their own. And this is just kind of a list of some things. There's going to be other things to be assessed on the survey, but things like inclines, distance from buildings, the transportation options, whether there's something from place to place. I was at another research station recently. It was in Canada, so it wasn't an LTER, but there was a big hill that went from the lodging to the one of the main buildings. But I wasn't able to do that, but they gave me a golf cart, which was excellent and a lot of fun. and sleeping arrangements, bathrooms, and even looking at things like doors. Are they easy to open? How difficult are they? You don't necessarily need maybe an access door, but if it's a light door, that might be helpful. If it's a heavy door, that can be really difficult for a lot of people. Safety features, are they accessible? Is there blinking as well as sounds? What can be put in place? Food situations, access to fridges, contamination levels with food stuff for sensitivities or allergies, sensory concerns such as buzzing and ticking. This might seem really nitpicky, but yes, that is what I'm going to be, just to give a full picture of what the place is like. Distance to hospitals, sizes and space and layouts of rooms. Are these able to be changed? How dense is it? Ceiling height. These kinds of things, again, might seem like a lot, but it can actually really help a lot of people understand what kind of situation they might be in. The plan is, after I get all of this, is to kind of distill this and synthesize it into a database. And it will walk someone through all the different features of each site. So again, they can assess whether that location might be a good option for them to carry out field work. And then, like I said, you'll be surprised at what's already accessible. But then I'll also do some suggestions for improvements, and this will come into various tiers of feasibility and finances. So something that might be easy, moderate, to loads of effort. Okay, I know I talked quickly, but I wanted to make sure we had some time to go over some questions that I have for you and would love feedback on. And so we're going to break out into groups of 4 for 10 minutes. That's a long time, so we'll check in. But there are slides. So if we can put the Google PowerPoint into the chat so everyone can access it, that would be great. But I want you all to kind of talk about whether, if you've been to a site, what are some things that you've already seen that's awesome, something that you might be excited about, that you want to highlight for us, or just even place on the note slides you'll see once you open the Google Sheet thing. Hurdles that you might think, there's plenty that I will not have thought about yet and would love to hear from you. Issues that might arise during this survey. What are you concerned about with this project? There's, any ideas you might have. Also, if you don't want to necessarily put these on to the board themselves, you can DM me or email me later on.